I'm Chance Dorland, and in San Antonio, military means local. This is Military City, a new podcast from expressnews.com. San Antonio Express News senior reporter Sig Christensen was embedded with the 3rd Infantry Division during the U.S.-led invasion of Iraq in 2003 and has reported on military-related topics for decades. Each week, Sig and I will discuss the military stories important to San Antonio, both from today and the past. And today, Sig, we're talking about something from this week, the recent Memorial Day ceremony at Fort Sam. You were there. Tell me what you experienced on Monday.
Well, it probably was the single biggest Memorial Day gathering I think I've ever seen. They had a line of cars not only going through the cemetery, but down the main road leading into the cemetery. And there was a huge crowd there on hand. This was perhaps in part because of the weather. It was sunny. There wasn't a cloud in the sky. It got hot. And before long, I think everybody was using their programs as fans, and a lot of people came out with umbrellas to shield themselves from the sun. The funny part about it is that last year they were using the umbrellas to shield themselves from a steady rain, and the year before it rained so hard that the ceremony was canceled. So it was a big ceremony, and in San Antonio, that's not a surprise. This is a city with a lot of retired military, a lot of serving military, and a lot of people come out. And by the way, we have an awful lot of wounded troops from the Iraq and Afghanistan wars that have settled here as well. So events like this are big deals.
And when you say canceled, so they just went and canceled that entire ceremony, you said 2 years ago because of the weather.
Yeah, we had a lot of flooding that year, and the rain was just coming down. And it's kind of an odd thing. We don't generally get rain like that, but yeah, it was one of those years. This one looks like with temperatures next week or at the end of this week forecast to be up to 106. It looks like it's going to be a killer summer for heat, and I don't think we're going to see a lot of rain. So just a different season.
Yeah, I don't know any figures offhand, but I remember reading in several different areas people were saying this was going to be and now has been perhaps the hottest Memorial Day weekend on record. So you're absolutely right. It was a scorcher, and you were out there. So we're going to get to some audio of some of the people that you spoke to, and also were just able to record on Monday at that Memorial Day ceremony at Fort Sam. Sig, let's get to the first of those audio clips. This is Colonel Sylvia Corona Sanchez, who served in the Army Nurse Corps and later joined the Texas National Guard. She is a past Veterans of Foreign Wars commander and served in Operation Desert Storm as an operating nurse in the 217th Evacuation Hospital. And this clip is of her giving a speech. So fill me in, Sig. She was speaking at this event.
Yeah, she was, and she gave what I would call a pretty typical speech about why we have Memorial Day, the point of it, the who we honor, and the point of that. It was this clip that you are hearing is one of the parts that I thought had the most meaning for me, and the crowd was I think pretty connected to the message as well. As I said, a lot of those folks are military people in some form or fashion, and so the whole meaning of Memorial Day, honoring the troops who have fought and fell, is a very solemn thing, and speeches like this go to the heart of what they feel about their service.
From the earliest days of America's founding, our great nation has been blessed with generation after generation of patriots willing to lay down their lives in defense of our freedom and way of life. We are truly fortunate to live in a country worth fighting for, to be afforded a way of life worth dying for.
So that was audio of retired Colonel Sylvia Corona Sanchez from Fort Sam on Monday for Memorial Day, that ceremony that Sig Christensen, who I'm speaking to right now here on today's episode of Military City, was at and recorded that audio clip we just heard. We're also going to have several other audio clips we're going to get to on today's episode. So Sig, tell me more about that ceremony. So there were people obviously speaking. How many people spoke? This was just one of those people?
Well, she was the keynote speaker, so she spoke the longest, but there were others who came up and spoke briefly. People in the crowd, I think, were maybe as much interested in the pomp and the circumstance. So you'll see a color guard or honor guard coming in. They're coming in to for the service medley, which the 323rd Army Band, which is a band from Fort Sam Houston, they performed the service songs, and people within the crowd who belonged to those services stood up. The Army starts it, and a lot of people, of course, stand up because probably the majority of folks who served during the Army, it's the largest service. The Air Force medley brings a lot of people, and there's usually one or two when the Coast Guard song gets played. So that's what you'd call an interactive moment in the ceremony. There were Gold Star mothers in the crowd, and they were acknowledged. Their children had been killed in the war in Iraq and Afghanistan. And Blue Star mothers were there as well. And we'll hear from a couple of them. These women are people I've known for many, many years. I've spoken to their group, and I've known them when they had their sons in the war zone, and they, of course, worried endlessly about them.
And yes, Sig, speaking of Blue Star mothers, let's hear from 67-year-old Chris Pechet of San Antonio, who is a Blue Star mother. Her son served in the Iraq War from 2003 and 2004. She told you she's been coming to the Fort Sam Houston National Cemetery Memorial Day ceremony for years and has been deeply involved in that Blue Star mothers group in the San Antonio area. How did you end up speaking with Miss Pechet?
Well, it was funny. I was like 5 feet from her. I noticed her. We came up to each other and hugged and talked. And then another woman from the Blue Star group was there, and I hadn't seen her in many years. They pretty routinely come to the ceremony, but it's hard for me to run into them because there can be 1,000 people at these events, and they break up pretty quickly after the ceremony. So I saw them, we started talking, and it brought back a lot of memories. I was going into and out of Iraq when I first met Chris, and they asked me to speak about it. And I was pretty honest about what I was seeing and where the war was going. And there was no hoorah business in that speech that I gave to them, and they appreciated that. What I learned from dealing with these people, whether they've lost children or had children serve and come home, is that they wanted to know the truth. And that, of course, was what we were going in and out of the theater of war to do, find out what was going on and tell them. And I will just point out that we weren't terribly popular either with the Bush administration for going in and doing that, or people within its base who were supportive of the war. We had people saying, even then, that we were making up the news or that we were hiding in our hotels. That's something that one of the Bush administration officials said, and that was just a typical slanderous political statement. It wasn't true. A lot of people were getting out. They were talking about what was going on, and then they were reporting it. And later, when the war started going south, guess what? It turned out that the reporters had been telling the truth. And you can go back to Vietnam and find David Halberstam and Mal Brown and a whole bunch of other reporters who were there, including Peter Arnett. They were reporting the truth in 1962 and 63, and eventually everyone came to understand that they were telling the truth. So just as a reminder to folks out there who say we're just reporting fake news, no, we actually report the truth, and we generally don't get a lot of credit for it, which is fine. But in time, you learn that what we said was true because you can't maintain a fiction forever.
To remember them. I don't want them forgotten. That's why I did my calendar.
This is your calendar?
Yes.
Tell people about it.
It has the pictures of a good number of our fallen from this area, but also from the surrounding area. It has their pictures, some with their children, small children, some with girlfriends, some with parents.
And so, Sig, we just heard from 67-year-old Chris Pache, who is a Blue Star mother in the San Antonio area. She mentioned the calendar during that clip. Tell me a little bit about her calendar.
You know, this is a really important thing to remember. If you haven't had somebody go to war, if you don't know anybody, you can be sure of this. People like Chris Pache and every Gold Star mother, every day they live with the loss of people that they loved, people they knew, and they never stop grieving. And some people might say that's ridiculous, you've got to move on, but nobody grieves in the same way. Everyone grieves differently, and these people cling to the memories of their kids. We found one woman out there who was laying on a blanket, and she goes out to see her husband's headstone frequently. It's really a somber thing. She said that she met him. He came to her restaurant one day, and he said, "Wow, what a woman!" And she couldn't say anything because her husband was sitting. Her future husband had brought in a woman with him who was a stripper of all things. So it was a funny way to start a relationship, but they got married. They were married for 17 years. He would bring her a flower every day. And now when she goes out to the headstone, she brings him a flower. That's how she remembers and loves her deceased husband who served in Vietnam in the Navy. And there are other women who go out there, and fathers too, who visit their children's grave. They talk to them. They think of them. They talk about it on Facebook, and it is something that never is far from their hearts. And so, this day in particular brings a lot of those people out.
And then finally, Sig, our last two clips involve a serviceman and his mother. We'll get to that here in a moment. This is 27-year-old Aaron Honey Ajour of San Antonio. He was a Marine who served in a southern Afghanistan province from 2009 to 2010 and then left the Corps as a corporal. So after the ceremony, you spoke with him about his time in Afghanistan, which was always a hotbed of Taliban activity and one of the most violent parts of the country. This is his first clip where he talks about what comes to mind when he goes to Memorial Day ceremonies, or at least when Memorial Day comes around each year. And before we hear this, how did you connect with Aaron Honey Ajour back on Monday?
Aaron was standing next to Chris Pache, and Aaron's mom, Brenda, was there. And he started talking. And he went into kind of a stream of consciousness recollection of his time in Helmand province. Helmand is a really dangerous place. The Marines have been there for a long time. The Taliban were very violent there. And the Marines, to their credit, got it under control. It always seems as if the Marines get some of the worst places. Helmand was very much like Anbar province in Iraq, which also was a base for the Marines and a very, very violent place. I've been to Anbar and was glad to survive it. Helmand, we did not quite get to. I got to the province next door to it in 2010. And so he talks about the stories that these Marines lived. And I'm sure that he's in touch with all of his buddies, and they talk about these stories whenever they get together. They'll drink beer. They'll talk about the people who died. I'll never forget two guys I met who were in uniform in New Orleans in the French Quarter once. And they were there because they promised to meet in the hometown of their buddy, whoever their buddy was who had died. So their buddy from New Orleans had died, and they came to the quarter to remember him. They were getting very drunk. I bought them cigars and drinks and took them into a club to listen to some music. They were doing what they thought was the way they should honor their friend. It was their way, and I felt really bad for them because they all come home having lost friends, and they have these memories of combat. What you're going to hear is kind of a brutal stream of consciousness from Aaron because he's got a lot of those memories.
Some of my friends were getting blown up, and we'd go out there and have to pick them up because they couldn't bring a helicopter in and they weren't going to walk them out, so we had to go in there and try to get as close as we could and then get them in the trucks and get them to the landing place so that they could get picked up by the helicopters. Those are the types of things. I mean, it's just interesting, especially on the first deployment. First deployment was when they were telling us about thing, and they were saying it was like Vietnam, and these guys had, some kind of like bamboo shoots in the ground with shotgun shells with a little nail on it. You step on it, it blows your foot off, and grenades in the levels and
toe
grenades.
poppers.
Yeah, toe poppers. And a lot of the guys were actually, they weren't, I don't think they were IEDs. I think they were leftover munitions from like the war with Russia or whatever that they had back in the day. A lot of those were just mines that nobody had ever found. And a lot of it too was like, they wouldn't tell the kids where they were if they did plant a bomb. Like we had one kid that he got, this one, we were watching him because there was like 12 kids or so playing soccer, and we were watching them with the blimp, and one of the kids stepped on a I don't know, whatever it was, but it cut him off from here, and then this leg was like right about there, and the guy, like it was an old guy, and he shoved him in a van, and they started barreling towards the base, and we were like, well crap, if that thing's full of explosives, do we shoot it? Do we not shoot it? We don't know. So because I was in the CLC when that happened, they were watching it the whole time, and they were debating on whether they were going to tell him to shoot the guy. And
he's just trying to get his kid in for
yeah, but if you think about it, if that would have been full of explosives, and there's the 10, 15 dudes.
With backpacks full of explosives all the time.
Yeah, so anyway, they decided not to shoot, luckily, but, they came in, they got the kid on a helicopter. This little 13-year-old kid, with his legs blown off. I don't know if he ever, I don't even know if he would have made that.
And our final clip, Sig, also involves the 27-year-old that we just heard, Aaron Honey Ajour, as well as a little bit of his mother, Brenda, who's 62, living in the San Antonio area, standing next to him at the time that you recorded this audio on Monday during that Memorial Day ceremony. He admits that he kind of stopped informing his mother about what was going on because he thought, no surprise, it would probably stress her out. Is that something that you hear from different people, or perhaps does each serviceman or woman kind of handle things in their own way?
I think most of them never say much about what happens. When I was in Anbar, we had what was called a morale room, or where they had phones. So the internet was just so bad. You took 30 minutes to get a message, a simple email to transmit. We tried to set up my satellite uplink, by the way, but it was too dangerous. There was a sniper up there, and he was killing people left and right, and we just gave up on it. So these Marines were on the phone, and they would call home. And I remember one on the phone talking about his kid. He said, his hair is too long, you've got to get it cut. And they would talk around the war. This guy wasn't mentioning that we were having firefights in Ramadi every single day, sometimes on the hour. He wasn't mentioning that the explosive ordnance people were blowing up buildings all around us in the middle of the night, which made it really difficult to sleep. And they were doing that so they could have clear fields of fire to shoot back. This was a place where there was a sniper. Everybody called him the Chechen, and this guy was either a myth or perhaps he was several people. But people were very nervous. You didn't walk. You didn't go slowly. You ran anywhere you went because this guy was shooting people, and they would often be shot in between the body armor. He would actually find a way to shoot between the helmet and your body armor in the neck or somewhere like that. And that's how really good snipers work. And so this was an extremely dangerous place. And these guys just didn't talk about it. And when they come home, I don't believe they talk about it. And I also think that that creates problems with families because the wife will say, "You're not talking to me. You're not opening up," and part of it is they're going to say, "You weren't there. You can't possibly understand it." But the other half of it is, if they go back, those stories are just going to cause their spouses to worry more than they did before.
I stopped telling her what was going on because Dad told me it was stressing her out too much. Like, I'll tell you one thing, those bulletproof windows, my window alone had like 8 bullet holes in it.
Oh.
Yeah, from those super thick glass. I got a picture of it.
Well, thank goodness y'all had that protection because they didn't.
If it would have been the British, man, those guys.
And Sig, that's our final piece of audio. Once again, that is 27-year-old Aaron Honey Ajour of the San Antonio area. Also joining him there in that second clip for a little bit was his mother, Brenda, 62 years old of the San Antonio area as well, talking about, as we briefly mentioned before we heard that audio, the fact that many servicemen and women probably don't go into a lot of details. And that's something that I think a lot of us can understand, even though we haven't had that same type of combat experience. That's only just human nature. We do have a few moments left, Sig, and I know we're not going to really have time in today's episode to talk about your recent profile of Second Lieutenant Clovis Rae, who was killed in Afghanistan. But something that I did really enjoy from that article, aside from the information about Second Lieutenant Clovis Rae, was that you talked briefly about the history of Memorial Day, and that's something that I will freely admit I obviously didn't know much about, because I was very surprised to find out that Memorial Day has only been the holiday that we know it now today as since I think the early 70s, right? Could you talk about that?
Richard Nixon was president. That's correct. It was 1971. And before that, it was people remembered the dead. It goes back to the Civil War. After the Civil War in 1868, it was a holiday to mark the Civil War dead, and it was an opportunity for national reconciliation and healing. I think that was probably the best thing that you could have done with a holiday, and so Civil War veterans from both sides would be involved in those ceremonies. That was a big deal because, as we know, the Civil War was a very bitter, contentious conflict. People thought it wasn't going to last 6 months. Well, it lasted almost 5 years. And it was just terribly bloody. And there's a story that Joe Galloway tells in the movie We Were Soldiers. Mel Gibson is playing the character of Lieutenant Colonel Hal Moore, and Joe Galloway's character is telling him about how his grandparents fought, if I recall correctly, on different sides of the Civil War, but they both lost their legs. Now, I could be wrong about the different sides of the war, but these were Civil War veterans who fought and lost their legs, one the right leg and one the left leg. And they met and talked, and they ended up going to the same shoe sales, the same shoe shop in Galveston every year to buy a new pair of shoes, and one would get the right shoe and the other one would get the left shoe. It's a funny story, but the Civil War has all kinds of stories like that, and so this holiday begins as an opportunity to bind the wounds of that war and reunite the country. And it's kind of evolved. I mean, a lot of people would probably argue that it's a great opportunity to go out and barbecue. It's a 3-day weekend, and people go out and barbecue, and nobody much thinks about the military unless they've been in it. If you have been in the military, if you have gone to war, it becomes a very, very different thing. People remember their friends who were lost. So I have a friend in San Diego who works for the Union Tribune, Carl Prine. He was in the Pennsylvania Army National Guard in Anbar Province, and he remembers the people that he served with who were killed during their tour of duty in Anbar. And it's very moving. That's how Carl remembers it. I remember it for all the times I went out on patrols with these people, and I remember some of the people who didn't make it, including the reporters. So I remember Chris Hondros, for example, who was killed in Libya. And I remember David Gilkey, who was killed a year ago or so in Afghanistan. I remember some of the others, David Bloom, who was on my bus that took us to the assembly area. In Kuwait, that's where we got ready to embed with our units and go to war during the invasion. And last but not least is a guy I got to know. Michael Kelly was just one of the most decent people I ever got to meet. One day we were in our hotel, and after lunch we decided to take a walk, and I didn't think it was going to be a long walk, but it turned out to be a 10-mile walk in Kuwait in March of 2003. We went all the way down to the Al Sharq Mall, which is a very famous market in Kuwait City. We stopped, we had a Coke, and we walked back. He talked about his book project. He talked about his children and his wife and his in-laws. They all were in the same town. He had a really wonderful life. And Michael Kelly, I came to realize, was just one of the most decent people I'd ever met. Really low-key, a real reporter. He would walk into a room, he would not want to be noticed, and he made sure he wasn't noticed, but he was there with his notebook. And he was there working on a book that was going to be about the 3rd Infantry Division's history in this war. And we ran into each other on several occasions, including a night before we began the Karbala Gap offensive. And then 72 hours later, Michael was dead. So I think about that. It's not a day to sit there and just barbecue and drink beer and take a nap. For me, it's a day where I do a lot of thinking, and that's just me as a war correspondent. I can guarantee you that every veteran does something like that, and sometimes they do it alone. Hopefully they've got family around who love them, but it's a really it's a really emotional day for a lot of people. And I want to just mention Clovis briefly, because I want to come back to him on another show. Clovis Rae is a great example of a veteran and a great American. Clovis was a banker here in San Antonio. He had brought himself up. He and his twin brother were self-made people. They lived in the projects in a small town 70 miles south of here called Three Rivers. They were really pretty good students. Clovis was an exceptional student. He graduated 4th in his high school class. He would keep spreadsheets on all kinds of things, including how fast he was running his miles. He was really analytical. He, of course, applied that analytical knowledge to a business career. He graduated from Macalester College, which is, I believe, in Minnesota, and he went to work in a bank. He was a financial planner. Obviously, he was good at it. He was making good money, but he felt that something was missing. He had considered joining the military twice before, and his brother had talked him out of it. Part of the reason why was because they were twins, and they were really close in a way that I can't understand, but twins obviously do. And also, their father had gone to Vietnam and come back with severe PTSD and could not even work. That's why they ended up being so impoverished. And so there were a lot of concerns, but Clovis really wanted to lead men, so he quit his bank in San Antonio. He went to officer candidate school. He went to ranger school. He was one of the top ranger graduates. He had the top physical testing score. He was 33 years old, or 32 when he started training. And he was probably the best conditioned soldier out of 200 plus that he was training with. He then went to Afghanistan to replace a officer who was wounded and was sent home. And Clovis Rae was on the point, leading a mission at night, looking for improvised explosive devices ahead of the road. His men in their armored vehicles, buttoned down in their armored vehicles, while Clovis was out on point by himself. He could have sent someone else to do that job, but he was there to lead his men. And that's when the enemy detonated an improvised explosive device, a roadside bomb, and he was killed. The funeral back home was extremely emotional. There must have been 800 people in the Coliseum in Three Rivers. That's close to half the town. And as I got to talk to people who knew Clovis, I realized what an outstanding person he was and what an awful thing it was that he had been lost. He was a man who had all sorts of things to give to the world, not just the Army. And we are at a tremendous loss without him and people like him. And so when I was thinking of Memorial Day in the week or two before the holiday came up, I thought about Clovis and I said, we need to write about him again. I want people to know him. And if you know Clovis Rae, you know an awful lot of troops in the field. They're people who are fighting for themselves and for each other. And they're really not even judging the war. If you talk to Sebastian Younger, you'll know that his experience is that they don't talk much about the politics of war when they're in the theater. They just talk about caring for each other and taking the fight to the enemy. They're the best of all of us, and it is really good to remember them on Memorial Day. I wish there were ways to make people who haven't been there and done it feel closer to all those people, because they're just a wonderful bunch.
Well said, Sig. And of course, thank you as always for joining me for our different recordings of this new podcast, Military City, but of course, especially for today's topic of, as you just mentioned, Second Lieutenant Clovis Rae, and also Memorial Day. So as always, thank you so much, Sig, and we'll speak to you here in about another 2 weeks.
Thank you, Chance.